Hello, my name is Pshenichny-Mamo and I am a PhD student at the Faculty of Education in Science and Technology at the Technion. My supervisor is Dr. Dina Tsybulsky and she is also the head of our Biology Education Research Group. Today I will present you our research about the integration of the nature of science during guided tours of natural history museums. Nature of science can be viewed as a concept that relates to the various characteristics of science, including epistemic cognitive aspects and institutional social aspects. Considerable research on nature of science has been done in the context of formal education, indicating that the understanding of nature of science facilitates and improves students' learning of scientific content, arouses interest, and encourages critical thinking. In addition, understanding of nature of science provides tools for dealing with and correctly assessing scientific information. In the context of informal education, little research has been done to date. This has led us to conduct a research about nature of science in natural history museums. Nowadays, we are all witnesses to global and local changes. For example, global warming and species extinction. To know how to deal with them better, we need to be aware of natural history. Natural history museums are an excellent environment to teach the public about natural history, due to the curatorial, educational, and research activities that take place there. That's why these museums are at the forefront of making scientific knowledge and narratives accessible. Natural history museums have the opportunity to shape public opinion about scientists as a community and science as an activity. The real challenge of these museums is to combine explicit reference to nature of science with the attempt to make visitors' experience with science enjoyable for them. In natural history museums, the exhibitions are an important communication tool between science and museum visitors. The museum's educators act as mediators between the visitors and the exhibitions, and play an important role in shaping museum visitors' educational experiences. Thus, it is important to examine how they reference nature of science to better understand the way they convey the nature of science when guiding the public through the exhibits, and how it impacts the public's understanding of the nature of science. This study was conducted to learn about how natural history museums can make scientific knowledge accessible to the visitors, while mediating the different aspects of nature of science. Our aim was to examine the nature of science aspects that museum educators refer to during their guided tours. The theoretical framework for the analysis was based on the Dagger and Erduran family resemblance approach. Dagger and Erduran claimed that the nature of science can be viewed as a concept that relates to the various characteristics of science, including epistemic cognitive aspects such as what is a scientific theory, what is a scientific model, which evidence is acceptable in science, and institutional social aspects such as how does society influence science, what is the scientific consensus, what is the role of peer review. This approach is comprehensive and systematic, covering all aspects and rules of science, and provides a new way to unite its various characteristics. The research participants were 15 museum educators, 10 women and 5 men, working in 4 natural history museums located in different regions in Israel. They varied in their degree of education and the extent of their experience as museum educator. All of them had agreed to participate in the study. The research was done with a qualitative approach. Data were collected using semi-structured interviews, which were recorded and transcribed. Each participant was interviewed once for approximately 45 minutes using Zoom. Examples of questions asked in the interviews. How do you reference to the characteristics of science and scientific research during your guided tours? What are the topics of the guided tours at the museum? What are the main points in these tours and how do you relate them? The data were analyzed using content analysis. The units of analysis were the museum educator quotes related to scientific topics and information about science. The focus was on expressions related to the cognitive epistemic and social institutional aspects of nature of science, as presented in the family resemblance approach. The findings show that the museum educators mentioned different aspects of nature of science during their guided tours in the natural history museums. The most frequently mentioned aspects are presented above. We can see that the museum educators mainly addressed the epistemic cognitive aspects of nature of science, including scientific practices, scientific knowledge, aims and values, and methodologies and methodological rules. While the social and institutional aspects of nature of science, such as scientific ethos, social values of science, and social certification and dissemination, were addressed less often. The epistemic cognitive aspects were referenced 139 times, while the social and institutional aspects referenced only 34 times. As you can see, the difference is marked. Next, I will present examples of quotes regarding each of these aspects. One of the museum educators claims that, as a museum educator and a researcher, I try to emphasize the importance of the scientist's role in making science accessible. I also explain to the people the importance of the things the scientists do. In other words, the things that are discovered through scientific research. I try to bridge those gaps in the opportunities I have. I try to help people understand the importance of science and what research means. The museum educators refers to the professional activities by mentioning the scientists as sharing their ideas with the world, which is one of the social institutional aspects of nature of science. Another museum educator refers to social institutional aspects of nature of science by mentioning the scientific enterprise as respecting various social values, including respect for the environment. There is Father Schmidt's exhibition, in which there is a ring stork. This stork represents the first ringings, and the transition from research which required the killing of animals to study them in the laboratory to research on live animals. The stork was ringed in Hungary and hunted in Israel. There are a lot of opportunities there. It depends on the group or visitors. Discussions about hunting being immoral. I try to connect it both to past culture and how we learned many things in that way. Recently I had a school visit, and I asked them how they can learn about animals today without killing them. Then we talked a little bit about technology and the behavioral sciences and ecology. Here we can see that the museum educator refers to the social certification and dissemination of scientific knowledge. One of the examples I really like. One of the weirdest animals on Earth is the platypus. As a part of the process that the platypus went through in being recognized as a species, it was brought as a stuffed animal to scientists, and no one was willing to define it, because it was a stuffed animal. In fact, until someone presented evidence that it was a living animal, no one believed. They did not believe it had been a real animal and thought it belonged to a union of stuffed animals. Until a living individual was brought to Europe or England, the Australian species was not defined. Museum educator mentions that scientific knowledge requires strong evidence to convince peers that the conclusion is valid. The next quote presents that the scientific knowledge is tentative and can be changed over time, which is one of the epistemic cognitive aspects of nature of science. I think it's very interesting in guided tours to tell how it used to be, how people perceived nature, what paradigms were accepted, and how people behaved. Probably Natural History Museum 100 years ago, it was completely different. Natural History Museum is a scientific body and not a body that came to display the wealth of collections that were hunted around the world. So, on the same principle, both research and the way we understand everything is changing, and it will also probably continue to change in the future. So I think this is a significant advantage that the science has. The fact that it's supposed to change makes it a lot more interesting. Another example for the epistemic cognitive aspects of nature of science. If I describe to visitors the way of thinking that a scientific process requires, for example, I have a theory and I want to test it, then I will do experiments. Then, from the experiments, I will either draw conclusions or not. To show the people that science is not just, oh look, I found something, I decided it's true, but I'm examining things and I'm challenging my perception all the time. A big part of the Natural History Museum is teaching people how natural science works. The museum educator refers to aims and values of science by mentioning that scientific questions are testable and scientific information is verifiable. The next exhibit in one of the natural history museums shows running numbers which present the number of extinct species this year in yellow, loss of wild forests per day in green, and world population at that moment in blue. At this point, one of the museum educators says, when telling the visitors that scientists who do macroecological research take all the research worldwide and unite it, and from that we draw huge conclusions about global warming and how species disappear. The random numbers on the wall look like they are going up for no reason. I explained to them that it's mathematicians sitting with ecologists and statisticians. People are amazed by this. It's a pleasure to talk about it, because people sometimes do not understand that there is a research behind it. We can notice that she mentioned the nature of science aspects of methods by referring to scientists' attempt to correlate information which might lead to new knowledge. In the next quote, museum educators tells the visitors about a finding caused by an accident in their laboratory. Research in our laboratory on the eastern wesp shows an existential connection between larvae and adults in a wesp nest. It turns out that there is no difference whether the larva is of an eastern wesp or not, and they live in coexistence. This happened accidentally in our laboratory. It's fantastic to tell that the reproduction and behavior are being investigated here. She refers to scientific practices as an epistemic cognitive aspect of nature of science by mentioning that mistakes often lead to new scientific discoveries. In the next slides, I will present our conclusions. Our findings revealed that museum educators primarily mentioned the epistemic cognitive aspects of nature of science. The nature of science were integrated as a part of their effort to enrich the narrative and increase the visitors' involvement with the content discussed. This suggests that in the course of a guided tour in Natural History Museum, most references of nature of science are incidental rather than planned, which means that the museum educators use an implicit pedagogical approach of nature of science integration throughout the guided tours. The contribution of this study, along with our additional studies, is the initial conceptualization of implicit and explicit nature of science guidance pedagogy at natural history museums. My future direction is to continue with the conceptualization of nature of science guidance pedagogy. This study has raised many questions, motivating me to continue my research to gain additional insight into how the nature of science can be expressed and mediated in natural history museums. Particularly, my PhD research aims to investigate the characteristics of what could be an explicit, reflective, contextualized, and authentic nature of science instruction, while integrating the nature of science during museum tours. During the summer school, my colleagues and I discussed what could be defined as an authentic context of nature of science instruction in natural history museums. I found it very important to understand, as the efficacy of an authentic context has been widely demonstrated in other settings. Thank you for listening to this presentation. If you have any questions, please email me or participate in the discussion session. Feel free to visit our research group website and read more about our work.